All right, do I do it? Do I start this off by going, men, 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 men? No, I don't. It's the easy joke. Let's fucking move on from that, shall we? Okay, so I saw Men last night, in which I mean the movie, not the gender, but I suppose I saw the gender as well while I was out last night at the movies. But no, I mean the movie, and let's actually talk about it. So this is going to be kind of a spoiler review, I suppose. It's not really a review, it's more of how I read this film. It's more of like a ending explained, I suppose. So yeah, if you're watching this and have not seen the film, get off right now because I am talking many details come the end. But I will also say that Men is not particularly a movie that can be spoiled in a way. It's much more metaphorical than plot driven. I'm not so sure you can say like, oh no, I've been spoiled when it comes to this movie, if that makes any sense. I guess I'll explain in a second and we'll just get to that. If I had to give the movie a simple critique, it would be that Men has a much stronger first half than the second half. As the first half is very grounded and just tells the simple story of a woman being terrorized by one man, and then a few men, and then once again even more men. The numbers just keep increasing and the situation just keeps getting worse. And all of the men are mysteriously played by the same actor. The first half had me giddy for great horror sequences and subtleties in its story. It had me caring for our protagonist here too, in a woman named Harper, who has been burned by a past trauma involving an abusive ex-husband, and she's come for a couple weeks to stay on the countryside in hopes of relaxing until creepy behavior starts showing up around her by the men who reside in this small country town. And from here on, the film builds up slowly with tension and fills us with a horrible sense of dread. And the first half is surprisingly straightforward and as compelling as can be. But it's where that second half very nearly lost me and did completely lose my wife, who I saw this film with, who said that it felt like two completely different people wrote the first half as compared to the second half, and that it started to contradict itself and just become a pretty bad movie in her opinion, which I really do quite understand, but I don't necessarily feel exactly the same way. But her comments that she made where it felt like two different people wrote it kind of made me think of like this hypothetical situation where it's kind of like a woman wrote the first half where it was very grounded, it came from a real place where it was about the emotions of a woman, and it was all about showing us how the potential danger of men make women feel. But then the second half, it kind of felt like this hypothetical man came in and said, look darling, I think I can do it better than you, look how smart I am. And then he came in and he started to just get up his own ass, and the second half of the film got super pretentious. I didn't love all the choices it made come the end. And if you ask me, I kind of think that Men starts to take one step too far, both visually and conceptually. But I still have to say that I love the film itself. I still feel quite strongly about this film in a positive way. I liked it quite a lot still, and I'm going to explain why. I actually don't think, contrary to popular belief, I don't think that the film Men is saying that all men, every man in the universe is bad. I think it's more saying that every man has the potential to be, and that we are all linked by that choice. I think it's more symbolizing that there is an unfortunate consistency in the toxicity in many men, even in those who seem trustworthy at first. Which reminds me of when it's revealed later on that the priest character in this film is also like all of the other men and is just as bad as them in certain ways, and how disappointing that moment is. I think he's the worst of them too, because as a priest, he's meant to be a symbol of hope and help. He's supposed to be the one that's looking out for you. So it feels like even more of a betrayal when it turns out that he's just as much a dick as everybody else. I also liked how the movie showed that even men who even have good intentions going in can still show signs of misogyny as well. Like when the one man named Jeffrey insisted on looking out for Harper, as if she was just this fragile woman. He was the big tough man hero coming through. He insisted on paying for her drinks. He wanted to defend her honor or whatever the hell. And I just thought that that was the film showing in a really clever way that sexism comes in many forms. But I actually think a better example of the disappointing male figure reveal scene, much like with the priest and Jeffrey here, happens in an entirely different film. I think Promising Young Woman did a better job of having us truly trust in a character and make us think that we really know who he is, only to later reveal that he was also part of the problem in a heartbreaking way. I think Men was going for something similar, but the titular men throughout were too symbolic to read as literal representations of people, in my opinion. This all reminds me, though, of a term that we use for a very specific type of person, a gentle giant. This describes a man who is particularly big and intimidating, but who genuinely wouldn't hurt a fly, as they say. But they have all the power to be harmful if they choose to be. And whether or not they choose to be isn't even the point. The point is that that power dynamic is still there. It's always a possibility, and it's really in their hands. I think the movie Men actually made me realize realize more than I ever had before that being a man in general is a bit more like that than I've ever really realized. It reminds me of this one time when I was just walking home after catching a train or whatever, and I was walking behind a woman who I guess was, you know, wherever she was going. I was going to say she was also trying to get home. I don't fucking know that, do I? Anyway, this was when I was a teenager, and I remember she kept looking back, possibly out of caution, or maybe I was even overthinking it. That's definitely a possibility as well. But I remember thinking that it was kind of ridiculous that somebody might be, you know, cautious of me or scared of me or whatever, because, you know, as me thinking of me at that time, I'm like, I'm a very unintimidating person. That's what I was thinking anyway. That is once you get to know me though. Once I actually think about it, I'm a pretty big guy, and I always have been. Even as a teenager, I always looked older. And this woman, who I'm sure doesn't remember me now, she didn't know that. She doesn't know who I am. She doesn't know that I'm not an intimidating person and all that kind of stuff. Being cautious is not really a sign of, like, I don't know, thinking all men are evil. It's just a sign of looking out for yourself, which is really an understandable thing to do, to be honest. I remembered feeling kind of guilty for being there, but I was genuinely just trying to get home, and we happened to be going in the same direction. Like I said, we all choose to abuse the power that we have or not, and I'm definitely somebody who doesn't choose to do that. But, you know, if it was somebody else, I guess that's the point. There's always that potential danger. Something else that I wanted to comment on in this movie is that I thought the very best scene of this whole film was the scene where Harper is arguing with her abusive ex-husband before he's the ex-husband. I guess they're still married at the time. But we start getting glimpses of this throughout the movie, but there's this one kind of extended scene of this flashback, this very dramatic flashback scene that I absolutely love. But I thought that this scene was particularly strong because it felt like it was coming from a very real place. It felt so true to me. It felt like this real toxic couple arguing about realistic things. And I just thought it was done so fantastically. It had nothing to do with horror. I mean, later on it did, because it has implications for what happens in the film later. But just this one scene alone, before Harper picks up her traumas from what happens in this scene, it's just a really well done dramatic scene. Kind of reminds me, it's actually kind of a consistency that I have in a lot of horror movies, where I kind of gravitate to scenes that are very grounded, that aren't quite so crazy and like supernatural or whatever in a lot of movies. It's kind of like the whole generic plot that happens in a lot of horror movies, where it will be like, you know, a couple going to stay in the cabin in the woods or whatever. And for the first 20 minutes or so of a movie like that, it's just like this weird romance movie. Maybe it's got hints that things are going to go darker later on, but like for that first 20 minutes, it's just like laughs and nice moments and stuff. And I always remember, like, in a lot of these movies feeling like that stuff is really impactful to me, especially as it contrasts later on when things get dark in a lot of these movies. I think I just like moments in horror movies before the shit goes down, if that makes any sense. Maybe it's because I know it's kind of like in the eye of the storm. I know things are going to go wrong, but there's something particularly beautiful, I guess, about a scene in a horror movie that doesn't lean too hard on the horror and really knows what it's doing with its own characters, if that makes any sense. In Men, it was really this arguing scene where I felt that way, where it wasn't a positive scene or anything. It wasn't making me smile, but I felt like it was the strongest content because it was the one that was closest to life. It felt like a real depiction of domestic abuse, and it felt like there was more nuance in it than things that happen later down the line that I'll get to in the movie Men. But this scene just felt like it was a real argument between a very bad couple, you know, people that do not work together, and it just felt like it was coming from a place of truth to me, and it just made it feel that much more impactful to me. But I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but it kind of was the whole point of the film, which I'll also get to soon. Now, by the end of the movie, we get an extremely uncomfortable scene where the men who have been haunting Harper throughout begin to create spawns? I don't know how else to word that. As they morph into newer versions of themselves, we get graphic symbolism of literal vaginal-like anatomy phasing into existence before giving birth to a new cycle of giant supernatural evil man babies, which sounds so fucking ridiculous when you say it out loud like that. I know, I get it. It's quite absurd. It's quite out there. But I think that if you let yourself buy into this, which I know is a tall order for some people and some people will not be able to, but if you can buy into it, I actually think that this scene is kind of ingenious. I actually like the message being made about the cycle of toxic traits that men often pass down to each other and influence on each other. I don't think that this was only commenting on fathers and sons just by the way, but more so in the effect that men have on each other's behavior. The graphic wrist injury as well that they all share from the very start of their new life cycle shows us that they still share the DNA of their predecessors, and basically showing that they still have these toxic and sexist traits. It's up to men to break that cycle. I also think that the film itself did a better job of this cycle of toxicity than I'm trying to describe here. Better in the direct previous scene to the weird giving birth to yourself scene. This is a scene in which Harper is trying to escape the house. She's trying to get to her car and get out of the area. And as she does, it keeps kind of cutting back to her still being in the house. She's getting closer to the exit, but she's still obviously being held back in yet again another symbolic cycle where she cannot quite leave. And it was here where I realized that I don't think the men in the film being played by the same actor is the only example of one actor representing a gender. I think Jessie Buckley here, the main actress of the film, might also be symbolizing many women in this one specific scene, showing that many women find themselves in these sorts of situations where they're dealing with domestic abuse or being assaulted by strangers or what have you. The way I read the scene is that this is a much more common occurrence than it should be. Maybe not so much being terrorized by an entire town of clone men, but in more of a way where the numbers do add up and that there are a lot of cases of bad things happening to women on men's behalf. Also, I wanted to point out that I also think that we are seeing the idea of men through Harper's eyes throughout the film. After her trauma and deep yet unrequited feeling of guilt following her ex-husband's manipulative and emotional abuse, and at least one form of physical abuse that we know about, plus his desperate attempts at winning her back and more likely his intentional suicide later on, she blames herself even though she shouldn't. And she's haunted by that last image of his broken body that the men in present day would later on resemble. Basically, the men in Harper's life have not been kind. And I think that we are seeing things through her vision here as well, where, you know, the more that this happens to one person, the more badness that a woman sees in men, I can kind of understand why they would lose trust, I suppose. And if there is, you know, if there is enough consistency, you're gonna start assuming. And I feel like Harper here would start assuming that all men that she comes across are bad, because she's seen enough of it to really make up her mind about it, that all the men that she's rarely encountered, that we ever see her encounter in the film, are all very negative memories for her. And I always used to get very offended by the idea of just assuming that every man is bad. And like, to an extent, I still do, because I'm a man, I don't think I'm a bad person, and you can't just assume that men are bad, but I guess everyone has their own perspective, and I think that's an unfortunate perspective and something that nobody should go through. That's a perspective that you gain through shitty situations, which is objectively a bad thing. But I sort of get the idea more through this film that while I don't exactly agree with the decision being made, because I don't think you can just judge anybody based on something like this, I do empathize. I also do want to say though that we are also seeing all these men in a small country town, so it's not completely out of this world that they might have some sexist ideals. I don't think that that necessarily means that they represent all men. Like I said, this is a film about toxicity and harmful masculinity, but I don't think that it's necessarily a takedown of every man in the world. It's really a takedown of the men who have these traits. After all, a man himself directed this film, you know, Alex Garland. I don't think he was outing himself as a giant piece of crap, but I may be wrong. He might be, you know, I don't know. He might just have this massive guilt for just simply being a man, which I've never really understood. I don't think you should feel bad for that. Something else that I wanted to comment on, though, this had nothing to do with the actual film itself, but I was in a cinema full of just 12-year-olds, and I don't mean literal 12-year-olds, children or whatever. I just mean my audience was immature as hell. Like, there are examples where one of the man characters might call the main female character a bitch, and it's as if that was the funniest thing that my audience had ever heard in their life. Calling that woman a bitch, what a classic. And I'm just like, are we watching the same movie here? I don't really know what's going on here. But especially when the naked stalker man showed up, every single time he was around, there was just roarous laughter. And look, maybe I'm exaggerating saying roarous laughter, but there was quite a bit of laughter. And to be fair, I do know that people laugh when they get uncomfortable, and I think that's more likely what this was. But even so, I don't know, it wasn't funny, and it just grow up. Just grow up, man. It wasn't funny, and it just annoyed me that my audience was laughing. But yeah, I do feel like a lot of people will watch this film and I don't know. It's going to make people uncomfortable and it's going to make people laugh because they don't know how to react. And I guess there's nothing wrong with that But at the same time, it annoyed me. So, overall, I thought that Men was really fantastic stuff. Even though I think it kind of lost its nuance come the end, I did overall think that it delivered in a haunting feeling throughout, and it definitely had very interesting horror concepts, and some really cool scenes in there as well that were just creepy, like a man jamming his arm through the, like, mail slit thing in the door, in the front door, that's just, creepy, get the fuck away from me. And also the scene in the tunnel where she's playing around with her echoes, and then there's this just mysterious creepy figure at the end, you know, this male silhouette at the end who begins chasing her. That was the second best scene. I already said that the argument scene was the best scene. That tunnel scene was the second best scene of this film. I absolutely loved it. Although, one thing I do want to complain about with that one specific scene though, is that when she's echoing down, I'm expecting that whole time for this very sudden, very kind of scary echo to come towards her instead. But when that does happen, it sounds like a crow. It sounds like a bird. And I just think that that scene would have been much scarier to me anyway if it was like this big, roarous man scream kind of thing. It would have just like, you know, there was like getting closer and closer to her. Like, it just would have felt much more impactful to me. It would have felt very intimidating to me. But instead, it was just like this crow sound, and I'm like, okay, that's not that scary. But I will say that I'm pretty sure the crow like symbolizes something. I'm not exactly sure what, but later on in the film, a crow does smash through a window. So I'm going to say there's a consistency there, and the crows mean something. Same as the apples falling out of the tree. But I don't necessarily know what these things mean. Sorry, I'm not sure. But yeah, overall, I thought that this was a really fantastic film, but it's not going to be for everyone. There are many ways that you can read this film, and I think that some people are going to read it in the wrong way. I think everybody seems to be thinking that it is saying that all men are bad, and that is the large majority who think that. And so I think it's a possibility I'm reading it wrong. I accept that possibility. That's fine. I'm just curious, I guess, what it was really trying to say. And I think that it is definitely a movie that is one that has huge potential for starting very interesting discussions among film fans and all that kind of stuff. So do that in the comments and shit. Let's talk about it. But also, before you go, please do the things, which are like, comment, share, subscribe, all that shit. And so there you go. I said the things that I have to say at the end of videos. Thank you for watching, and I'm outie. Goodbye.